Okay, so I'm sorry about that, but I'm just going to start just the introduction again because of the sound recording on my phone. So welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah Shiur. We're holding Mishnah Berurah. We'll be learning today Res Hashem Daf Lam Zayin Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn Siman Kuf Nun Gimel. We're learning the halachos that govern the sale of the basic knesses and what you may or may not do with the proceeds of the sale. So taking a look at the previous year, I see that we left off before Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Lamed Daled. I'm not exactly sure where we left off in the words of the Shulchan Aruch, but we're going to start off in the Shulchan Aruch on Lamed Vav Amud Beis, the second line from the bottom with the word Aval in the Mechaber. But before we even begin that, we have to go back and we have to give a little bit of a synopsis of what we've seen so far. So in Kuf Nun Gimel Sif Beis, the Mechaber taught us the halacha that when a Beis HaKnesses is sold, the proceeds of the sale are encumbered by the restrictions that the Mechaber mentions over there. What are the restrictions? The restrictions are that the Beis HaKnesses has a certain level of kedusha. When you sell the Beis HaKnesses, that kedusha transfers over to the proceeds of the sale. When you have that money, you cannot demote that money. You can't level that money down and use it for a purpose of lesser kedusha than the Beis HaKnesses. So you can't go ahead and sell the Beis HaKnesses and then decide to use the money, even if it's for other tzarchei tzibur. You can't just use it for chulin. You can't use it for something that doesn't have any kedusha. Preferably, you should level the money up. So we said, if you're selling a Beis HaKnesses, how do you level the money up? Well, theoretically, you could take the money and you could buy an Aron Kodesh. That would be a level up. Certainly, you could buy a Sefer Torah. That would be a level up. We had a machloikis, I think it was in Sif Daled, whether you could use the proceeds for something on the same level of kedusha. That's something that we discussed previously. But really what we want you to do preferentially is we want you to level up the proceeds of the sale. But certainly the Beis HaKnesses had kedusha, and therefore that kedusha transfers over to the proceeds of the sale. So when we were learning Sif Beis, we kind of took it for granted that you're allowed to sell a Beis HaKnesses. After all, in the Mechaber in Sif Beis, what he said was, B'nei ha'ir shemachru Beis HaKnesses. They went ahead and they sold the Beis HaKnesses. Now, the whole question that we have is, what do you do with the proceeds of the sale? How are they encumbered? What restrictions go on the proceeds of the sale? Even though in Sif Beis, the Mechaber used a lashon b'diavad, B'nei ha'ir shemachru, past tense, they sold it. That's always a lashon of b'diavad. The Mishnah Berurah told us that you're allowed to sell a Beis HaKnesses even lechatchila if you're leveling the money up. We're going to see a little bit further on. We're going to have a discussion about selling a Beis HaKnesses if there's no other Beis HaKnesses in the city. Obviously, if the tzibur needs a Beis HaKnesses, you can't go ahead and sell the Beis HaKnesses and level the money up if you're going to deprive the B'nei ha'ir of a Beis HaKnesses. But that we'll discuss later on. But again, in Sif Beis, really, the Mechaber was addressing the halacha from the vantage point of, you sold a Beis HaKnesses, now what do you do with the money? Here in Sif Zayin, really, the Mechaber started to tackle the question of, is it mutter to sell a Beis HaKnesses? Is it such a davar pashut that you're allowed to just go ahead and sell a Beis HaKnesses? So here in Sif Zayin, what the Mechaber has done is, the Mechaber has started to do a little bit of a deep dive into that question. When are you allowed to sell a Beis HaKnesses? When are you not allowed to sell a Beis HaKnesses? So the Mechaber told us, and we saw this in the Mishnah Berurah's Hakdama to Sif Zayin, that the permissibility of selling a Beis HaKnesses depends on the location of the Beis HaKnesses. And what we learned so far is, if the Beis HaKnesses is in a small town, then the people of the town are allowed to sell the Beis HaKnesses. If it's a Beis HaKnesses in a small town, then we make an assumption. We assume that the shul was built for the purposes of the local townspeople. Now, if a shul was built for the purposes of the local townspeople, and the local townspeople reach the decision that it is no longer needed, maybe there's another shul, there's a bigger shul, a nicer shul, maybe the area where that shul was, people aren't living there anymore, people moved uptown, they moved to a better section of town, so now where the shul is, it's just not being used anymore. So now it's time to sell the shul. So if the townspeople decide that they want to sell the shul, they are the bailim of the shul. They are the owners, so to speak, of the shul. They're the tzibur that owns the shul, and the fate of the shul is in their hands. Now, having said that, the Mechaber told us that allows them to sell the shul. Since they built the shul for themselves, they have bailus of the shul, it's up to them to decide whether the shul is still necessary or not. If they desire to sell the shul, they have the right to make the decision to sell the shul. Now, how about the proceeds? So we learned in Sif Beis that when you sell a shul, the proceeds of the shul could be encumbered. And you have to keep them at least on a certain level of Kedusha or level them up in Kedusha. But in Sif Zayin, what the Mechaber has introduced to us is that that's also not a simple question. It depends how the shul was sold. The Mechaber told us that if the shul is sold by the townspeople, now it seems that in the typical situation, you had the tzibur, you have the people of the town, but there would also be some kind of an administrational board, which we referred to as the Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir, the 7 chosen people of the city. That's in Halacha. We referred to this committee as the Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir. And we learned in the Mishnah Berurah what's up with this Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir. So what we learned is, really, the tzibur could even appoint one person in charge. If the tzibur would appoint one person in charge of the sale of the shul, then you don't need 7 for this committee. It can even be 1 or 2 or 3 if they are appointed and specifically charged with the responsibility of administrating the sale of the shul. But if there is no such committee, and instead what there is the tzibur has appointed kind of a board to oversee the inyane hatzibur, so then if there are 7 of them, then they're called the Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir, and then they rise to a certain level of authority. Now, how does this come back to us? So the way this comes back to us is very simple. Let's give a few different scenarios. Let's say you have a small town, a small village that has a shul. We assume that the shul was built for their own purposes, and they decide it's time to sell the shul. They don't have any board. They don't have an executive committee. They don't have a board. They don't have anything. There are 50 people who form a small community. Everybody's at peace with one another. They make all the decisions jointly. Now they had a general membership meeting, and the tzibur decided it's time to sell the shul. They have the right to sell the shul because the shul was built for them, and they have the right now to sell the shul. Not only do they have the right to sell the shul, but since now we're talking about a tzibur that does not have Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir, they don't have an executive board, they don't have any kind of administrational committees or anything else, so they are the final authority on the sale. Since they're the final authority on the sale, not only could they sell the shul, but when they sell the shul, the proceeds are not encumbered by the restrictions of Sif Beis. They are fully empowered to sell their shul, and not only could they sell their shul, but they could be mafkia the kedusha. They could remove the kedusha off of the proceeds of the sale, and now the money could be used for whatever they want to use the money for. And it's going to have to be used for iskei tzibur of some type because it belongs to the tzibur. But they want to make a gathering and they want to make a shul barbecue, they could buy the meat, the charcoal with the shul barbecue. They could be mafkia the kedusha off of the proceeds of the sale. Now, what's the mechanism of that? How does that work? We'll discuss that soon. That's one scenario. Now let's take a look at another scenario. Let's say there's a shul and there's a tzibur, and there is an executive committee. There is a board. So now you have Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir. Or you have one person, let's say, that was charged specifically with the authority of taking care of this sale of the shul. In that case, says the Mechaber, it depends how the shul was done. If the tzibur went ahead and sold the shul without consultation and agreement with the Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir, so guess what? It would seem that the sale is still a binding sale. But in that case, they do not have the power to be mafkia the kedusha off the proceeds of the sale, of the proceeds of the Beis HaKnesses. Yes, they sold the Beis HaKnesses, that power, that authority they have, because they are the tzibur. If the roiv hatzibur, if the majority of the tzibur decided it's time to sell the shul, they are authorized, they have the authority to sell the shul. But because they did it without the consultation and agreement of the Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir, the money retains its kedusha, and the proceeds are encumbered by the restrictions of Sif Beis. The same thing would be true if the Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir went ahead and they sold the shul without consulting the tzibur and without getting the agreement of the tzibur. The sale is a binding sale. Why is the sale a binding sale? Because the tzibur appointed the Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir, and they have the authority to do this. So if they sold the shul, the sale is a sale. But again, they don't have the power to be mafkia the kedusha off the money, and therefore the proceeds are encumbered by the restrictions of Sif Beis. Now there's one more scenario, and that is there's a tzibur, and there are Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir, and the sale was made with full consultation and full acquiescence. The shul was sold with the agreement of the tzibur. The Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir consulted with the tzibur, and they made the decision to sell the shul. So the shul was sold with the agreement of the Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir and the tzibur. And we saw in the Ramah, what does that mean? There doesn't have to be necessarily an official meaning. If the Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir put up big posters, in the shul, they put up big posters in the town, we're selling the shul, and nobody came and nobody was moicha, nobody objected to the sale, that means that the tzibur acquiesced to the sale. So now, if the shul was sold with the agreement and consultation with the townspeople and the Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir, that's what we called, it's a sale done by the Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir b'maimad b'nei Ha'ir, with the consultation of the townsfolk, then it's a binding sale, and now they have the power even to be mafkia the kedusha off the proceeds, and the proceeds are no longer encumbered by the restrictions of Sif Beis. You can do whatever you want. Now, before we go further, there's something that we have to tackle, and that is, first of all, what exactly is this kedusha that the Beis HaKnesses has? What's the kedusha that transfers over to the proceeds of the sale when there's a sale? And what's the mechanism by which we could be mafkia the kedusha off the proceeds of that sale? So one thing that we've seen so far is that the kedusha of a Beis HaKnesses comes from the fact that we refer to a Beis HaKnesses as a migdash ma'at. Just trying to see quickly if I can see where the Mishnah Berurah mentioned it. Yeah, it's on Lamed Aleph on the Beis. It's in the beginning of Siman Kuf Don Aleph, Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Aleph. The Mishnah Berurah said, Kihem Nikra Migdash Ma'at. There's a level of Kedusha to a Beis HaKnesses because it's called a Migdash Ma'at. And we bring down the pasuk from Yecheskel, Va'ehi Lahem LeMigdash Ma'at. And by the Beis HaMikdash, it says, Ves Migdashai Tira'u, Sheyehem Moiroi Shalashoichin Ba'ala. So the easiest thing for us to point to is to say that there's a Kedusha to a Beis HaKnesses, there's a Kedusha to a Beis HaMedrash, because they're referred to as a Migdash Ma'at. The Beis HaMikdash certainly had Kedusha, so the Migdash Ma'at also has a certain level of Kedusha. Now, the truth be told, it turns out that this is a Machlokes Rishonim. It seems to be a Machlokes the Ramban, the Ran, and the Rambam. Precisely what is this Kedusha Now, the Ramban seems to look at this in a very simple, kind of technical way. He looks at the Beis HaKnesses and he says, well, what is a Beis HaKnesses? A Beis HaKnesses is a building, it's a structure, that is used for a mitzvah. What's the mitzvah? The mitzvah is tefillah. The mitzvah maybe is limud Torah. So precisely what is a Beis HaKnesses, says the Ramban? It's tashmishay mitzvah. It's a lulav. It's an esrig. It's tashmishay mitzvah. It's a physical object that is used in the performance of a mitzvah. So the Ramban seems to look at this, and the Ramban seems to say that the kedusha of a Beis HaKnesses is the same kedusha as any other tashmishay mitzvah. Now, what's the halacha of tashmishay mitzvah? The halacha of tashmishay mitzvah, the Gemara in Megillah tells us, tashmishay mitzvah nizrakin. Really, when you're finished performing the mitzvah with tashmishay mitzvah, you're allowed to discard them. Now, you don't discard them in an oifen of bezoyin. You don't take your used lulav and just chuck it in the garbage together with your eating chicken wings. That would be a bezoyin. So that would be bizoy mitzvah. So you don't take tashmishay mitzvah and be mavaza them, but you could throw them out in an oifen that's not derech bezoyin. Now, yeah, we try to use it for things like burning it with the chametz, but technically speaking, if you want to pull out the adasim and the aravas from your lulav and you want to throw them into your backyard somewhere, so it's not an oifen bezoyin. They're going to go on the ground and eventually they'll disintegrate on the ground. That's not a bezoyin. I wouldn't necessarily throw it where people are going to step all over them. That I wouldn't do. But you want to put them down on the side somewhere, and it's not an oifen bezoyin. Tashmishay mitzvah dizrakin. Says the Ramban, okay, so here we have the Beis HaKnesses. Beis HaKnesses is a tashmishay mitzvah. Tashmishay mitzvah, if the townspeople reach the point where they say that the shul is finished, there's no purpose to the shul anymore, we don't need the shul anymore, so then tashmishay mitzvah nizrakin. So really, by the same token that they have the ability to sell the shul, they have the ability to say that the mitzvah purpose of this structure is finished. And therefore, tashmishay mitzvah nizrakin, and now the kedusha could be divested from the physical structure. Now, however, since we are talking about a Beis HaKnesses, it depends who's doing the sale. If the sale is being done by the Zayin Tuvei Yair b'Maimed Anshe Yair, so if it's really being done with all of the authority that could be brought to the sale, so then yes, so then we allow them to remove the kedusha off the proceeds because tashmishay mitzvah nizrakin. If the sale is done by the Zayin Tuvei Yair without the Maimed Anshe Yair, or it's done by the Anshe Yair without the Zayin Tuvei Yair, so then the sale is more of a shvacha sale. If it's more of a shvacha sale, so then the proceeds remain encumbered. That seems to be the sheet of the Ramban. There's a Ran. The Ran seems to lean, according to the Aruch HaShulchan, towards saying that this is all based on Takanas Chazal. That Chazal determined that there should be a certain level of kedusha to a Beis HaKnesses, and that Chazal determined that this is the way you could lift the kedusha. They made the rules; they could break the rules. So the Chazal said, we invested a certain amount of kedusha into a Beis HaKnesses. You want to divest it of the kedusha. So if the sale is done by the Zayin Tuvei Yair, by Maimed Anshe Yair, you can divest it of the kedusha. If it's not done that way, you can't. But then there's a Rambam. The Rambam seems to imply that the kedusha of the Beis HaKnesses is midaraisa. And what is it? It's a migdash ma'at. The kedusha of a Beis HaKnesses is as mikdash HaTorah. Now, if it's a daraisa, if it's based on es mikdash HaTorah, how do we divest that kedusha by doing a sale, even if it's a sale by Zayin Tuvei Yair b'Maimed Anshe Yair? So the Aruch HaShulchan suggests okay, we had a little bit of an interruption over there. The power went out in my house, so I lost my video. So today's shiur is only going to be on audio. There is going to be no video on today's shiur. All right, so now I kind of have to recapture my train of thought. So we were speaking about the level of kedusha that there is to a Beis HaKnesses, what it's based on, how we're mafkia the kedusha, and we said that according to the Rambam, it would seem that this kedusha is a daraisa. It's based on es mikdashi tiro. Now, if it's a daraisa, what mechanism is there to allow us to be mafkia the kedusha through a sale? So the Aruch HaShulchan says that what you have to say according to the Rambam is, how was the Beis HaKnesses invested with kedusha? The way the Beis HaKnesses was invested with kedusha is that the townspeople, whether it was with the Zayin Tuvi Yair, without the Zayin Tuvi Yair, but it's the townspeople who went ahead and built a Beis HaKnesses, consecrated a Beis HaKnesses, and invested the Beis HaKnesses with kedusha. Says the Aruch HaShulchan that what you have to say in the Rambam is that the Rambam looks at that as kind of like Hegdish al Tanai. When they went ahead and they invested it with kedusha, there's an unspoken Tanai that says that should the Zayin Tuvi Yair come along, b'mayim anshe Yair, and decide that it's time to divest the Beis HaKnesses from kedusha because they need to sell it and they want the proceeds to be unencumbered, they may do that. So now we have a little bit of a better understanding of what's going on over here, what's at play over here when we discuss the sale of a Beis HaKnesses and the status of the proceeds. And that really finally brings us up to where we're going to start really today's page, and that is 2 lines off the bottom, Lamed Vav Amud Beis, middle of the line, says the Mechaber. Till now, we were speaking about a Beis HaKnesses located in a kvar, in a small town or a small village, and that's where we operate under the assumption that the shul was built for the purposes of the local townspeople, and therefore the local townspeople are the bailim of the shul. They are fully authorized to sell the shul. Not only that, we even learned that even if they took donations from outside the town, they're still allowed to go ahead and sell the shul, and they don't have to consult the donors. And that's because we assume that the donors that gave money towards the building of that shul, they were giving the money to those townspeople to do with as they will. They're not using the shul, these donors. They're not coming there. This place, this town that has the shul, this is not a destination. This is not a place that people are coming. This is a small town somewhere. They needed to raise money, so there were some generous donors that wanted to help the people of this town to build themselves a shul. But it's not being built for people outside the town. It's being built for the people of that small town. Now we come to the halacha of a krach. What's the halacha of a shul that's built in a large city? And based on what we learned in the Mishnah Berurah's Hakdama, when we speak about a large city, it's not really a question of the size of the population. It's not a question of how physically large the town is. The question is the type of town. Is this town a destination that people come to from all over the Jewish world? If people come to this town because there's a gadol in the town, because there's a rebbe in the town, because there's a marketplace in the town, if this town is a destination, then we have to assume that this shul was built not just for the purposes of the locals. This shul was built really for the entire larger Jewish community. This shul was built because the people of the town are fully aware that people come to this town from all over the place. And therefore, they're not the bailim of the shul. You know who is the bailim of the shul? The whole Jewish community. Because this shul was built for the whole Jewish community. It was not built for the people of this small town. Maybe because we're now holding in July, as I mentioned this halacha, I'm thinking to myself of shuls in upstate New York. When you have a shul in Woodridge, you have a shul in Woodburn, you have a shul in I don't know, I'm not sure about South Fallsburg, maybe there too. These are shuls. The shul in Woodburn, where the Nicholsberger Rebbe now is over there in Woodburn, that shul is a destination. Everybody comes upstate, not everybody, you have thousands and thousands and thousands of people who travel to upstate New York during the summer, and they're all counting on that shul. So does that shul belong to the tiny little year-round community of Woodburn, and the tiny little year-round community of Woodburn could go ahead and decide to sell it? That shul really belongs, I'm not going to say to the whole Jewish world, but to the Jewish world of the New York metropolitan area, where so many people go to vacation upstate and count on that shul. I would say the same thing of the Woodridge shul. So these are shuls that don't belong just to the little town in which they're built. These are shuls that really belong to the larger Jewish community. And in that case, it's not so simple that the inhabitants of the town could get up and sell the shul, because they're not the bailim of the shul. Let's see what the Mechaber says inside. Aval shel krachim, when we're talking about shuls of a large city, which we've defined as a destination, shebaim sham mimekaymes acherim, where people come from all over the Jewish world, and they're coming from far and wide to this area, then says the Mechaber, afilu banu aisai mishalahem, even if the shul was built using the funds of the locals, einay nimkar, that shul cannot be sold. Now we're going to stop over here for a moment and take a look at the Mishnah Berurah, because before we go further, we're going to have to mention a couple of caveats. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut and limud daled. Now we did limud gimel already in the last shiur. A synopsis of limud gimel is just what we said. The reason why the shul cannot be sold is because the shul does not belong to the locals to sell it. The shul belongs to people all over the place. Now I do want to go back into this Mishnah Berurah. Go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines up from Ois Katan Lamed Daled. So go 5 lines up near the end of Ois Katan Lamed Gimel by the words V'chol Zeh, because it's important for us to mention this right now. Says the Chavetz Chaim, V'chol Zeh, all this that we just said, that you cannot sell a Beis HaKnesses of a krach, a Beis HaKnesses of a large city, V'chol Zeh mistama. This is only in a normal situation. But if we know, if it's clear to us that this shul in the large city was built having in mind only the locals, Kigain, for example, shehisnu be'es binyanam, we know that they made a t'nai at the time that they built it, where they said, we're not building this for the whole world. We're building this because we need a shul. Or another case would be, Shevashas binyan hoisa kvar, or maybe when they built the shul, it was a tiny little town, and people were not coming from all over. And then suddenly it grew into a krach. And other people from other places in the world didn't help out with the construction. Then it's considered a kvar. So right away what we see now from this Mishnah Berurah is we have a mechaber that tells us that you can't sell the shul of a krach. And the reason you can't sell the shul of a krach is because the people of the krach are not the bailim, they're not the owners of the shul. This shul really belongs to the wider Jewish community. So you can't sell it without the agreement of the wider Jewish community, which it's not practicable to get. And therefore you can't sell the shul. But right away we see here in the Mishnah Berurah that the Mishnah Berurah qualifies this. And the Mishnah Berurah says, it's not true that you can't sell the Beis HaKnesses of a krach. It depends what the situation is. The only reason you can't sell the Beis HaKnesses of a krach is because we assume that it was built having in mind the purposes of the wider Jewish community. But if we know for a fact that it wasn't, if we know that they made a t'nai at the time that they built the shul, and they spelled out beferish that they're not building it for the whole Jewish community, they're building it only for the local community, then the local community could sell it. We saw earlier in the Mishnah Berurah's Hakdama to this sif also. He said that if we know that, let's say, the people from the krach, all the people of one trade in the krach, all the tailors of the krach got together and they built the Schneider's Stiebel, so then also the Mishnah Berurah said, then it could be sold even though it's located in the krach. So it's not a flat-out rule that you cannot sell the shul of a krach. You can't sell the shul of a krach when this logic holds true. When there's a valid assumption that the shul in the krach was built for the wider Jewish community, then the people of the krach are not authorized to sell the shul. Eis Katan Lamed Dalet, Einoi Nimkar, V'davke Kishamachru Be'inyan Shelo Yehi Achakach Beis HaKnesses. Another qualifier, says the Mishnah Berurah, this idea that you can't sell the Beis HaKnesses, that's only true if you're going to sell the Beis HaKnesses and it's no longer going to be a Beis HaKnesses. Aval Amachakach Gam Ken Yishar Beis HaKnesses, if it's a question of selling the shul from one entity to another. So let's say there's one group of people that own this Beis HaKnesses, and they want to sell it to another entity. So it's a shul in Woodburn, and the owners of the shul are going to sell it to Nicholsburg LLC. But it's going to remain a Beis HaKnesses. Says the Mishnah Berurah, in that case, if it's still going to remain a Beis HaKnesses that is used by the tzibur, mutter, then of course you can sell it. What difference does it make for the people that are coming from New Jersey and from Connecticut and from Philadelphia and from Borough Park, if the Beis HaKnesses is owned by Woodburn Davening LLC or by Nicholsburg Davening LLC? That doesn't matter. It's a Beis HaKnesses, so of course you can sell it. Okay. Now the Mechaber turns around and the Mechaber adds his own qualifier to this halacha. And this was the piece of the Shulchan Aruch that was giving me a very hard time. Says the Mechaber, you can't sell the Beis HaKnesses of a krach, ela im kein tolu oisoi bedas hayochid. Now, to translate these words literally, what the Mechaber is saying is, you cannot sell the shul, the Beis HaKnesses of a krach, ela only im kein tolu oisoi bedas hayochid. If, and according to when the Mishnah Berurah learns this, if when the shul was built, the tzibur gave over the building of the shul and all decisions that have to do with the shul, they gave it over to one individual. Sha'az, in that case, continues the Mechaber in the top line of Lam Zayin Amud Aleph, Sha'az, then, Yaseh B'Hayachid Masha Yirtzeh, then this single individual could do what he wants, B'Haskamas HaTzibur, as long as he gets the Haskama of the Tzibur. As long as he consults with the tzibur, he gets the agreement with the tzibur. Now, before I say anything else, let's just take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah in Eis Katan Lamed Hey says, Elim Kei Tolu Oisai Bedas HaYochid. What does that mean? Hainu, says the Chavetz Chaim, Shetolu Be'eis HaBinyan Es Beis HaKnesses Al Daitoi. When the shul was being built, they gave over all decisions of building the shul to this individual. Valkain, and since they gave over all decisions to this individual, this single individual now has the power of Shiva Tuvei Oir. Now, let's stop here for a second. What stumped me over here is the following. We have learned that you could sell the Beis HaKnesses of a kfar because the people who live in the small town, they're the quote-unquote the owners. They're the bailim of the shul because the shul was built for their purposes. They built it. When they want to sell it, they have the right to sell it. It's their shul. The whole question that we struggled with was, what is the halacha of the proceeds? What are the status of the proceeds of the sale? And that, we saw, depends how the sale was done. Now came along the Mechaber, and the Mechaber said, but not so the Beis HaKnesses of a krach. When it comes to the Beis HaKnesses of a krach, you cannot sell the Beis HaKnesses of a krach. Why can't you sell the Beis HaKnesses of a krach? Because you are not the bailim. The people who live in the town, they're not the owners of the Beis HaKnesses. This Beis HaKnesses was built for everybody. Since the Beis HaKnesses was built for everybody, there might be somebody who lives in Timbuktu who might object to the sale of the shul, and he has the right to object to the sale of the shul. Why? He doesn't live within 100 miles of the shul. No, but still, people travel to this destination from all over the world, and therefore the shul was built for them as well, and they also have a certain bailus in the shul, and you have no right to go ahead and sell it out from under them. Somebody's been traveling here for years, and they know that the Woodburn Shul is here, and they can always catch a Shacharis in the Woodburn Shul. Who are you to turn around now and go ahead and sell out the Woodburn Shul and sell it out from under tens of thousands of vacationers who come up to the Catskills for vacation 2 months a year? That's what the Mechaber told us. Now says the Mechaber a caveat, a qualifier. But if the Shul was built, if they were Tolu Oisai B'das HaYochid, if when they built the shul and they gave over all of the power to a yachid, now suddenly this yachid could go ahead and he could make the decision to sell the shul. And by way of explanation, what does the Mishnah Berurah tell me? Since this individual was invested with the authority over all decisions that have to do with the building of the shul, at the time that the shul was built, he has the status of the Shivitu Ve'ir. So what? How does that allow him to go ahead and sell the shul out from under everybody else? And the fact that he's like the Shivitu Ve'ir, what does that mean? What we saw so far about the Shivitu Ve'ir is that in a kfar, if the shul was sold with the agreement of the Shivitu Ve'ir, but Maiman Anshe, then the proceeds of the sale could be taken out to chulin. What does that have to do over here? By what mechanism is this person now allowed to turn around and sell the shul out from under the feet of the people from the wider Jewish world who have a level of bailus in this shul? So the truth is that if I look at the Aruch HaShulchan, the Aruch HaShulchan says very simply, the way the Aruch HaShulchan poses the question, he says, and I'm reading from the Aruch HaShulchan, he says, I don't understand. V'hinei en revusa klal bazeh. The Mechaber is not telling me any chiddush over here at all. Why? The pshita de t'nai metchilasai mahani. It's a davar pashut that if the people of the Krach built the shul with a t'nai, that they're building it for themselves and they're allowed to sell it when they want to sell it, it's a davar pashut that they're allowed to sell it. And the truth is, we saw that already. That's why I read from Mishnah Berurah's Kat Lam and Gimel. That's what the Mishnah Berurah told me. The Mishnah Berurah told me, in Barulan Deloy Banu El Adaita de Bnei Yirim Levad, if we know that when this shul in the Krach was built, it was not built al das kol ha'olam, if we know that it was built only for the purposes of the people of the Krach, then we already learned in Mishnah Berurah's Kat Lam and Gimel that then you're allowed to sell the Beis HaKnesses of a Krach. We learned that if all the tailors got together and they built the Schneider Stiebel in a Krach, then the Schneiders, the tailors, are allowed to get together and sell the shul, even though it's in a Krach. So now the Mechaber comes, and the Mechaber tells us, big chiddush, if when you built the shul, you gave all the decisions benegayed to building the shul over to a yachid, you should know the yachid is allowed to go make the decision to sell the shul. Frek Aruch HaShulchan v'hinei en revusa klal bazeh. You're not telling me any chiddush. The pshita de t'nai b'tchilasai mahani. We know that if a t'nai was made up front when the shul was built, that t'nai is effective and it allows the people of the Krach to sell the shul. Well, my kamash malon, what are you teaching me? And also, what's the point of the Mechaber telling me that when they built the shul, they gave over all the decisions to a yachid? If the people who built the shul made it tonight, they don't have to give over all of the authority to one person. In other words, Frek Aruch HaShulchan, if you read the Mechaber seems to be saying, you can't sell the shul of a Krach unless one crazy case. if they gave over all the power at the time of the building of the shul, they gave over all the decision-making powers to one single individual, then that individual can do what he wants. Says Dirshu Shulchan, I don't know what you're talking about. If they made a Tanai up front that they're building the shul for themselves, they could sell it. And if they made such a Tanai, they don't have to give it over the power to a Yachid. And if they do give over to the power of Yachid, it doesn't matter. If they did give the power to a Yachid, then Lamatzar Chaskamas Hatzibur. Says Dirshu Shulchan, I'll ask you another question. If they taka did what the Mechaber says, and they gave all the decision-making power over to a single Yachid, so then why does that Yachid need the Haskamas HaTzibur? That's what the Mechaber says. Why do you need the Haskamas HaTzibur? If there was a Tanai Mefurish that gave this person all the Kayach, what do you need Haskamas HaTzibur? Says Dirshu Shulchan, and I would have saved myself a lot of time, but not. It was Amel's Pateris. I get scarred for it. It's a very strange thing. I usually look at the Dirshu Shulchan as a matter of course, and for some reason I didn't. And instead I struggled with these kashas for a long time. Says Dirshu Shulchan, Amnam Inyan Keinu. The answer is as follows. The Mechaber is talking about a case, Shaloi Haya Tanai Mefurish. They did not make a Tanai when the shul was built, that the shul is being built for the people of the Krach, and they should have the right to sell it if and when they decide to sell it. Ella sheteloi kol habinyan bedas hayachid. But what they did do was, they appointed one single individual to take care of all of the issues of building the shul. Shehu yivna al daitoi, that he should build the shul on his das, on his decisions, and he should be the one in charge of all expenditures and all decision making on the shul. In this case, tells us the Mechaber, in that case we say that this person has the right to do whatever he wants. He can even sell the shul, and then he could even use the money for chulin. He could be mafkia the kedusha from the proceeds. So now, the first questions that the Dirshu Shulchan is answering, the Dirshu Shulchan is learning the Mechaber like this. The Dirshu Shulchan is telling me, yes, there's a problem with selling the shul of a krach, because the shul of a krach was built al das kol ha'olam. Now, if you know that the shul was not built al das kol ha'olam, if there was a Tanai Mefurish that it wasn't built al das kol ha'olam, you're allowed to sell it. If one group of people got together beferish and built it for their own purposes, they want to sell it, they could sell it. I'm telling you now a chiddush. The Mechaber is not coming and saying you can't sell the shul of a krach, ella, only in this crazy case where you invested all the authority in the yachid. The Mechaber is telling me a chiddush that this is another case where you could sell the shul of a krach. And really what the Mechaber is doing is like this. He's telling me you're not allowed to sell the shul of a krach because of the problem that it belongs to the whole world. Now, if you took care of that problem in another way, if you took care of the problem because it's a Tanai Mefurish, so then it doesn't belong to the whole world. And that's another pashut. I don't even have to discuss that. What I'm telling you, says the Mechaber, is you're not allowed to sell the shul of a krach when the problem of a shul of a krach exists. Ella, but there's a case where you could sell the shul of a krach even when the problem of the shul of a krach does seem to apply. Even if you're a destination where people come from all over, and even when there was no Tanai Mefurish up front, it's not the Schneider Stiebel, and it wasn't built Mefurish only for one group of people. So it would seem that the Isser of selling this shul of a krach should apply, says the Mechaber, but there's another case where it doesn't apply. You should know, if when this shul was built, all of the decision making of the shul was handed over to one person, and that person was invested with all the authority necessary to make all decisions on the shul, meaning he's picking out the carpet, he's designing the Aron Kodesh, he's hiring out the company to make the plaques, he's getting the lighting people to make the lighting, then guess what? Even though nothing was ever discussed about what should be if we want to sell the shul, you want to sell the shul, go to him. He's authorized to sell the shul. Not because he made a Tanai Mefurish at the time that he built the shul, saying that if I want to sell the shul, I should be able to. No, the question of selling the shul never came up. The Mechar is telling me a very big chiddush. The Mechar is telling me, since 30 years ago, you invested all of the authority of decision-making powers that have to do with the building of the shul in this person. You want to sell the shul now 30 years later? If he authorizes it, then you could sell the shul, and not only could you sell the shul, but you could be mafkiah the proceeds to chulin. Why? Because since you invested him with that level of authority, he has this level of authority too. He has the level of authority to say, I want to go ahead and sell the shul, and I can even sell it out from under the feet of the people who come here from all over the place. Why? Because I'm the boss of the shul. I can do what I want because that's the authority that you gave me 30 years ago. Now, says the Aruch HaShulchan, that's why he could only do it by Haskamas HaTzibur. The reason even he needs Haskamas HaTzibur, says the Aruch HaShulchan, is Olachein tzarich lazeh haskamas hatzibur desoif dina ketchilas dina, because the power that he has 30 years down the road is only and completely dependent upon the power that was invested in him 30 years previously. The geshem shebetchila hisa haskamas hatzibur alav, since his original power was only based on haskamas hatzibur, what he wants to do 30 years later is also dependent on Haskamas HaTzibur and Tzarech Haskamas HaTzibur. Now, I want to add to this just one more thing, and that is Bir Halacha on Lamed Vav Amid Beis in Dibra Baschel Aval Shel Krachim shows me another case where even when the problem of a basic necessity of a krach applies, even when you would think that you should not be allowed to sell the shul because the people from the wider Jewish community are all bailam on the shul and you can't sell it out from under them, but you can, even though you're not logically taking care of that problem. You're not mitigating that problem. You see, in everything that I just said, the fact that this shul, that one person was invested with the authority over all decision-making when it comes to the building of the shul, it doesn't mitigate the problem of the fact that it's a basic knesset shel krach and people in Lakewood count on it and you're selling it out from under them. See, when you know that there was a Tanai Mefurish up front, when you know that when the basic knesset was built, the people said, we're not building it for the whole world, we're building it for ourselves. So then you're mitigating the problem that underpins the isser of selling the Beis HaKnesses. But in this case of the Mechaber, the way I'm learning Pshat, the way the Aruch HaShulchan is learning Pshat, where the one person that was invested with the authority of all decision-making at the time of the building of the shul, he now has the right to sell the shul. Why? We're not mitigating that problem. It's still, we're not saying that it wasn't built al das kol ha'olam. It very possibly was built al das kol ha'olam. But it doesn't matter. This person has the authority to go ahead and sell the shul anyway, despite that problem. Now, why? Why is he authorized to do that? So apparently, there is such a thing as a level of authority where, despite the fact that the shul might have been built al das kol ha'olam, I have so much power over the shul. I am the bailim of the shul. I'm sorry that you've been counting on this shul for the last 40 years. And I'm sorry that you think that the shul was built al das you. And I'm sorry it's even possible that the shul was built al das kol ha'olam. But now I am the sole arbiter of what's going to happen with this shul. So says the Mechaber. Now, where do I have another precedent for such a case? That there could be an authority that has so much authority over the shul that they could sell it despite the fact that it might have been built al das kala olam. In Bir Halacha, Divrei Amaschal Aval Shel Krachim. Kasa b'tshuvas masas b'yamin Siman Lamed Gimel. The ba'arotzos in regions sheminig hakehilos, where it's the minig of the congregations, lahamid aleim manhigim uparnosim, that they appoint over the tzibur manhigim and parnosim. These are decision-making people. V'lahem makel uritzua. And these are very powerful people. The tzibur give them over makel, which is a rod, uritzua, and a strap for whipping. B'chol iskei akehila. It doesn't mean that they literally have the power to go beat people and whip people. But what it means is you give them a level of authority that we refer to by makel uritzua. These people have full authority. They're the last word. Then, ein chiluk b'kfarim l'krachim. Then there's no difference between a small town and a krach. Why? Because ubechol inyan yesh lehem kayach biyad manhigim. These manhigim have the power limkar beis hakneses to sell a shul afilu lemishte be'shechra. They could sell it to be a bar. V'gam adamim yuchel lo yitziam lechulin, and they could be might see the money lechulin afilu anshe eir meicha biyadam, even if the people of the town protest. So says the Masas Binyamin. So what do you see from this Masas Binyamin? You see that there is a level of authority over a shul, even a basic knesset shel krach, that allows that body of authority to go ahead and sell the shul, even if they're selling it out from the under the feet of people in the wider Jewish community, even when the shul was built, having them in mind as well. And that's what the Mechaber is telling me over here as well. The Mechaber is telling me, you have a Beis HaKnesset Shel Krach. You have a Beis HaKnesset Shel Krach that was built al das kala olam kuloi. Yet, if at the time that the shul was built, the authority was invested in one individual to go make all decisions pertaining to the shul, 30 years later, that person has the right to decide that he's going to sell the shul, as long as he does it bas kamas atzibur. Okay, I'm going to stop over here, even though we missed yesterday, and now we didn't do a page today. But I spent the time today because I thought it was necessary for clarity of what has become a very, very unexpectedly complex topic. I also apologize that there is not going to be any video for today's shiur because of the power outage, but I'm happy that at least, Baruch Hashem, we had the sound recording. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. This was limud HaTorah should be banging against Klal Yisrael. The Rav Shem should send Yeshua Sefurus Parnas and Shidduchim to all those in need, and we should be zeicher to see the B'Yeskel Tzedek b'meher v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.